Welcome to our webinar, our roundtable discussion this morning. I'm going to introduce the speakers and just say a little bit about the purpose of our gathering. I'm Mike Pothier. I'm the program manager of the Catholic Parliamentary Liaison Office, one of the sponsoring organizations. We are co-hosting today with the Democratic Governance and Rights Unit at the UCT Law School, with the Hanns Seidel Foundation and with News 24. This is being streamed on some of the News 24 channels. Our purpose is to try to understand a little bit about the implications of the recent Zimbabwean harmonized elections locally and regionally. We sit here as a neighboring country. We are part of SADC. We're part of the African Union. What happens in any one of the countries in this region obviously has ramifications for the others. There's a particularly strong relationship, if you like, between South Africa and Zimbabwe. Our government has taken a particular stance on democracy in Zim, or the lack of it, which is quite troubling to a number of us. We want to try to understand a bit more about that. Also to look internally at what the future holds for Zimbabwe itself. And as I say, then to consider also the position of SADC, which seems to have changed this time round. And those are all some of the themes that we're going to be exploring. We have, it looks like 4 speakers. Let me say that one of our speakers, Dr. Primrose Bima, contacted us late last night to say that she's on her way back from Frankfurt and flight has been delayed. So we're not really expecting her to join us. Although if she does come running in at kind of 11:30 or something, we'll accommodate her. We'll first have a presentation from Professor Brian Raftopoulos from the Nelson Mandela School of Public Governance at UCT. I think anybody who follows Zimbabwean affairs knows Professor Raftopoulos very well by reputation. And he's going to give us a presentation, an overview of the situation. And then after that, we'll go into more of a kind of panel discussion with the other 3/4 potential speakers. We have Ms. Kudzai Mepo, who is a researcher at the African Center for Transnational Criminal Justice, Colin Chibango, the executive director of the Tutuma Zimbabwe Trust, and Dr. Justice Mavizenge, constitutional and human rights lawyer, and a senior research fellow at the DGRU at UCT. So we'll form a little panel up there on the stage and try to unpack the issues. As usual, we will allow a little bit of time at the end for your comments and questions. For the audience that's following this on Zoom, please make use of the Q&A or the chat box to enter your questions and your comments, and we'll do our very, very best to accommodate them and bring them to the attention of the speakers. That's always just a little bit tricky. We're hoping to get through this session without load-shedding interruptions. We're on generator at the moment. I'm a little bit worried about what will happen just after 12 o'clock when the power kicks back in, because when the generator kicked in at 10 o'clock, it threw out the routers and we had to restart the meeting. So again, for those of you on Zoom, if shortly after 12 you find yourself being kicked out, please just rejoin the meeting. It should be a fairly smooth process after a couple of minutes. The last thing I want to do before I invite Brian to come up here is just to ask you to take a minute. As we always say, Catholic Parliamentary Liaison Office is a faith-based organization. We take a minute at the beginning of all of our events to gather ourselves, to invoke the Holy Spirit on what we are doing, if you are religiously inclined, and even if you're not, simply to gather your own thoughts and to remind yourself why you have joined us this morning. Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm now going to hand over to Professor Brian Raftopoulos.
Thank you, Mike, and thank you to the Hanns Seidel Foundation, Catholic Commission, GGRU for the invitation. I'm very glad to be here to speak to you all about the latest iteration of a long-term crisis in Zimbabwe, a long-term multi-layered crisis that has placed not only Zimbabwe, but the region in a very difficult situation once again, and has raised new questions about the erosion of democratic rights and the consolidation of authoritarian rule in Zimbabwe. I think the first point to make is that we need to look at the context prior to the election, which set the stage for the kind of election that took place. And that we saw for several years after the coup in 2017 and the election controversial election in 2018, a systematic attempt to dismantle the opposition and the civil society movement. One was the use of the judiciary to remove Chamisa from his position as president after Morgan Tsvangirai passed away. And this was in part due to quite a clumsy transition within the MDC itself and the problems of that transition. Second, the facilitation of a more pliable leadership of the MDC under Douglas Monzora, and to control the opposition under him, the official parliamentary opposition. Third was the creation of a political actors dialogue, POLAD, which was controlled by ZANU-PF, an attempt to present the facade of national dialogue. Chamisa's party refused to join because they saw it as a subterfuge by the ruling party. And fourth, harassment of opposition party members, and in pre-election campaign, more than 110 rallies were barred by the police in the run-up to elections. This also included, of course, harassment of civic activists, journalists, lawyers, as we've seen very recently. The space for civil society also has closed down due to two new forms of legislation. The Private Voluntary Organizations Act. This amendment threatens the right to freedom of expression, of association by controlling civil society organizations, governance and program activities. These include management choices and funding elections, funding decisions. The act still awaits the signing of the president, but the effect of the fear that it's induced has already had its effect on civil society. The second, of course, is the Criminal Code Codification and Reform Act, commonly known as the Patriot Act, which will effectively deny Zimbabwean citizens the right to speak to any foreign power critically about the Zimbabwe government, in particular in relation to sanctions. And then the increasing use of the Maintenance of Peace and Security Act as the government of Zimbabwe's weapon of choice to prosecute citizens. This legislation closes down space in civil society more than we've seen in the post-independence period. It's one of the worst forms of legislation that we've seen. And unfortunately, it kind of replicates the colonial period. It's within this context, of course, that the elections took place. And we saw that, in the presidential elections, Mnangagwa won 52% of the vote and Chamisa 44%. In the parliamentary elections, ZANU-PF 136 and CCC 73. This gave ZANU-PF the majority vote, but not 2/3 majority that it was hoping for, which would have meant that they would be able to change the constitution much, much easier than they are able to now. The response of the observer missions. I think, yeah, since 2008, the last critical response of SADC was to the follow-up election in 2008, which was very violent after the 2007 deadlock, and which caused a lot of violence and concern for SADC. It led, of course, to the Mbeki intervention, which led to leading a SADC team to discuss a GNU, which took place from 2009 to 2013. And this was a context in which there was some consensus at national, regional, and international level to move beyond the crisis into some kind of dialogue. And that's one of the lessons we learned. any form of dialogue will only take place if you have these three levels of consensus moving in. And through this, at this election now, we saw for the first time since then, a very critical response from the SADC observer mission. And at several levels, they criticized the election. One, the delimitation report failed to observe the correct methodology, calculating 20% variance constitutional rule with respect to minimum and maximum sizes of the 210 constituencies. This created controversy over more constituencies being given to ZANU-PF. The delay in the release of the voters' roll, the cancellation of CCC rallies, the oppressive implications of the PVO Amendment Act and the Patriotic Act, the excessive increases in the nomination fees for presidential and parliamentary candidates, with the former increasing from 1,000 US to 20,000 US, and the latter from 50 US to 1,000. Questions around independence of the judiciary, the unlawful repressive activities of the quasi-security intelligence operation known as Forever Zimbabwe FAZ, whose members occupied desks at several polling station exits, the lack of fair coverage by the state media, and the denial of entry of several foreign media outlets into the country, the late arrival of ballot papers at polling stations, particularly in the opposition supporting areas of Harare and Bulawayo. Many polling stations did not open at the required time, with voting time extended into the next day. Others ran out of ballots. Primary data analysis suggests that voter turnout was lower in these areas. And lastly, cases of voters who were not able to vote because of various challenges, including the absence of names of voters' rolls, voters ending up at wrong polling stations, and the lack of IDs and passports. This interim report of SADC was emphasized and reiterated by other missions. The Commonwealth expressed similar concerns, concluded that while the voting process was well conducted and peaceful, there were a number of significant issues that impact on the credibility, transparency, and inclusivity of the process. With the report of the African Union also noting these issues, combined with critical statements from the US, EU, the US, the Carter Commission, as well as a spokesperson for the Secretary General of the UN, there's a growing consensus of opposition voices within Zimbabwe, regional, continental, and international bodies on the legitimacy crisis of the 2023 elections. In many ways, this has been, as some commentators have said, the worst election of the post-colonial period, the most delegitimized in many, many ways, through various reports have shown. What are the implications for this at regional and international level? Well, we've seen, as I said, the SADC has presented its report, but we've also seen some very divided positions from SADC. We have already, Mnangagwa received quick congratulations from the Namibians, president, and certainly three presidents attended the inauguration from South Africa, Mozambique, and the DRC. But we've also seen, of course, that the Zambians have been much more critical. And this, what does this mean? Does this mean that we have now a divided SADC, or that we're likely to see a divided position of SADC on the report? And this has huge implications, because it means that even if that report is critical, it could be sidelined, it could be subordinated if there's sufficient lack of consensus within SADC on the way forward. And as we know, the issue of liberation politics, the narrative of national sovereignty, this has often taken precedence over democratization and human rights questions. We've seen the Secretary General of the ANC replicate the narrative of ZANU-PF, casting the opposition as agents of Western change, and casting the democratic intervention as somehow not an indigenous process. The irony of this, of course, is that the liberation struggle itself, at the center of it, was the battle for democratization. was the battle for human rights issues. Now we have narratives on national sovereignty, on anti-imperialism, which create a dichotomy between a critique of the West and democratization, when in fact the two are linked. But the ZANU narrative has been since the Mugabe period that we are the ones who brought democracy to Zimbabwe. We are now fighting imperialists. Anybody who fights for democracy now is on the side of the imperialists. Not noting the historical trend in which the battle for democracy was not only fought by liberation movements, it was fought by other movements in the anti-colonial period, trade unions, women's movements, NGOs, that there was a broader grouping of people who also fought for democratic rights. There were also tensions within the liberation struggle itself over democratic issues that have been recorded. So that now to hear Mbalula replicating this narrative for the ANC is very disturbing, because it also, perhaps it relates to the fact that the ANC faces the elections next year. They're also trying to capture a certain narrative that will bring them into trail with other liberation movements in Zimbabwe, and to incorporate narratives that may be used by other parties within South Africa to try and gain traction. So that this is a very disturbing moment, not only for Zimbabwe, but for South African politics. And for SADC, as I said, it's a huge issue. And we know, of course, that for President Ramaphosa, the BRICS issue is a major issue. And we know in the BRICS formation, democratic rights issue are not paramount. We also know that the battle for Zimbabwe is also about natural resources. China for lithium, the Russians and Belarus for gold, South African companies for platinum. And so there is the crisis in Zimbabwe has material interests from the region, from the international players who are supporting this authoritarian politics that's going on. And that has also, as I said, huge implications for the future of this politics in the region. SADC has protocols to deal with this that they have put through the SIAC, and specifically 4 areas that they could use to urge and encourage SADC members to adhere to SADC principles and guidelines governing democratic elections, to encourage SADC member states to adhere to international best practices whenever they hold elections, to advise SADC members on strategies and issues to enhance and consolidate capacity of electoral management bodies, to encourage SADC members to uphold and respect independence and autonomy of electoral management bodies. So what's likely to come out of the final report of SADC is recommendations going forward. Any changes that are likely to place, SADC will say these are up to the government. These are about national sovereignty, so it will depend on the judiciary, on the legislature within Zimbabwe, which means that it's back under the control of an existing authoritarian regime. And it means that whatever recommendations are made, the existing government can choose what it wants to implement. And that will mean, as within the GNU, when there were reforms set out at the beginning of the GNU in Zimbabwe between 2009 and 2013, not all those reforms were implemented because the control of the GNU was still largely within the hands of ZANU-PF. And they used that period to consolidate the rule. And again, any reforms that are suggested here will be a problem. The other option, of course, is the current discussions with the Africa Development Bank on the dialogue on the arrears clearance. And one of the conditions of this dialogue, as stated by the president of the Africa Development Bank, is a commitment by the governance group to tackle and make measurable progress on critical issues of freedom of speech, human rights and protection, implementation of laws in line with the Constitution, as well as the implementation of the Motlanthe Commission inquiry and compensation of victims. And we must show progress on the Zimbabwe Democracy and Economic Recovery Act, all of which would make for peaceful, free, and fair elections. It will again be interesting to see how far this dialogue goes, whether in terms of real politics, they continue the discussion, they move forward despite the democratic deficits because of the material interests involved in the current situation in Zimbabwe. And that we have a problem there as well. Finally, for the challenges for the opposition, the CCC. The CCC have made the decision not to contest the elections to the judiciary due to the assessment that the Zimbabwe judiciary is fully and faithfully captured, which I think is a correct assessment. In addition, the CCC states that Zimbabwe lacks a functional separation of powers and the executive fully controls the judiciary. The opposition therefore concluded that there are no domestic remedies available to address the electoral practices and severely undermine the freeness and fairness of the 23 August elections. And therefore, the CCC is now likely to be concentrated on regional and international diplomatic interventions. The challenges of this are, first of all, of course, the CCC MPs have already been incorporated into parliament as well as local government. So in reality, they're part of the structures already, and they now have to balance that with the legitimacy debate and the international regional diplomacy questions. And how do they go about doing that? The second, of course, is that given the issues that I raised about SADC and the challenges that SADC is likely to face, and the fact that President Mnangagwa will be head of SADC next year, what does this mean for any kind of intervention by SADC? Will it create legitimacy issues for SADC? If this ruling party in Zimbabwe is allowed to get away with such a discredited election, what does it say about the region? What does it say about the protocols that are put in place by SADC? What does it say about the democratic legacies of the liberation movement? And what does it say about the future? Is the future discussion now going to be about the functionality of regimes to be able to control a certain accumulation process, which benefits elites within our region and international foreign players who are interested only in raw materials? And this applies, of course, not only to countries like China and Russia, but also the Western countries who have a long history of this kind of imperial extortion of funds, of resources within the region. So the balance of a discourse, the balance of a narrative, which is able to critique that imperial legacy, but also able to critique the authoritarian politics of liberation movements, is absolutely essential to any new movement emerging. We should not allow that debate to be submerged under one part of that legacy, because any anti-imperial politics also has to have, in effect, a democratic narrative which treats and respects the democratic rights of citizens within the region. And that, I think, is going to be a major challenge, not only in Zimbabwe, here in South Africa, especially in the coming election, especially given the kind of xenophobic narrative that's also infected the ANC itself, and also for future elections in this region. If ZANU-PF can get away with this kind of election, others are going to say, how are you going to judge me? What can you judge? That was a terrible election. Now you're going to come and judge me on what I'm doing? This has huge collateral implications for democratic struggles. So yeah, let me conclude and say, I think that for Zimbabwean citizens, people shouldn't forget that civil society in Zimbabwe has fought long to keep this democratic debate on the agenda. Since the 2000s, we wouldn't have unlike to have a new constitution in Zimbabwe without civil society. We've had civil society activists who have fought long to advocate at national, regional, and international level for change. They've been arrested, some have been killed, deported. Opposition parties, the MDC, fought elections fairly, won in elections, and were denied the right to take power. 2002, 2008. They've done everything peacefully to have a transition, and they've been denied that right. And here we are in 2023 with the worst election, emphasizing that deep lack of democracy in our country, but also the very poor at the moment, divided responses from SADC. And this is going to say something not only about the regime in Zimbabwe, but about regional politics and where we go from here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Brian. I'm now going to ask the three panelists to come up onto the stage and take a seat there, Brian, you as well. And then we will start to go into some of the issues a little bit more deeply. Please do put your questions in the Q&A and we'll take them from there. I'm just going to ask each of the three panelists here with me for just a quick response, a couple of minutes, anything in particular that struck you from Brian's presentation that you want to emphasize or even disagree with. Colin, can I start with you on your side there?
Hello? Hello? Good morning. Thanks, Prof. I think it was a very incisive presentation. My main take from it are the issues raised by the SADC observer mission, leading to them saying the election did not meet the standards of our laws in Zimbabwe and the SADC guidelines. Among the many reasons were the delimitation, delay of the voters' roll, independence of ZEC. Now, I would like to say that all the things that were mentioned, there was nothing new except the election day activity of the FAS organization. All these things had been said before by participating political parties, by civil society, and there was really nothing new. And CCC and other political parties went into the election begrudgingly, but knowing fully well what they were going into. I'm not too sure what the plan was, because really there was nothing new that was said by SADC. There was nothing new that besides the exit poll and the activities of FAS. I think there was really nothing new that they didn't know. So for us to then say, now that it has been said by SADC, then our elections, all of a sudden there's a frenzy in saying that we cannot go to the courts of law because they are captured. But we went into an election knowing fully well that ZEC is captured, knowing fully well that we have an unfree, unlevel playing field, knowing fully well that the three major political parties had agreed before, as mentioned by Douglas Monsora in his boycott message, that they were supposed to get polling agents trained for them so that the elections transparency can be improved, but the ruling party denied them this right, and they proceeded into the election. So I'm really questioning what the game plan was. To then say we cannot go to courts because they are captured, I think is I don't know the word to really use, but had they had all the V11s available, I think all captured institutions can be busted. If the V11s were there, they would have gone to court. But apparently, I think even ZANU-PF itself does not have the V11s. MDC does not have the V11s. I suspect ZEC itself does not have the V11s. It says something about the election that we just had in Zimbabwe. Maybe only FAS has the V11s. And lastly, I would like to say the presentation and the election speaks to what observer missions, international and regional observer missions, can and cannot do to ensure that the credibility, freeness, and fairness of elections. In Malawi and in Kenya, they actually passed, but the local courts reversed this. So I'm really trying to question what their role is and if it can be improved. Thank you.
Thanks, Colin. Kudzai, can I come to you next?
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Thank you, Brian, for your presentation. That was well detailed and informing. What is happening in Zimbabwe is quite interesting. And I think Brian has covered much of it, but there's a part of conversation that is actually being ignored or is being allowed to die. The issue of the diaspora vote. There are many Zimbabweans that are all over the world, and these people are being denied the right to vote. And I believe SADC should have had an input, particularly about those people, because in as much as they are in the diaspora, they want things to be better in Zimbabwe, and they're not being given an opportunity to actually voice out or choose a government that they want.
Thank you. Yeah, that's an important point, and I think we did overlook that particular one. Justice, your perspective briefly.
Thank you. And I'm going to be very brief, hoping that I will have an opportunity later on to address other things. First, I fully associate myself with the views that have been expressed by Professor Raftopoulos. I think there are a couple of writings that I did prior to this election. One of them is titled Prospects, Episodes of Violence and Prospects for the Democratic and Free Elections in Zimbabwe. It aligns with exactly what Prof. Raft mentioned with respect to the nature of the environment within which this so-called election was held. I went further, and I still hold those views today, that there was no election. There was never going to be an election. There was going to be a ritual that looks like an election. Where I have a different view with Prof. Raft and others is that this is the worst election. I don't think so. I think there's nothing new that happened in this ritual. There were nuances, yes. I think we have had, it depends on which, of course, criteria you're using. But I recall that 2002, I was much younger. There was so much violence in that election. And the Zimbabwe Human Rights NGO Forum has done a good job in documenting the number of people who were killed and the number of people who were displaced during that time. Then we had 2008 election. I'm sure you are aware of what happened there. So I don't think this is the worst election in Zimbabwe. I also don't think that this is the worst election in SADC. We recall we have had an election in Tanzania under Magufuli. And by the way, in Tanzania, the legal framework does not allow you to challenge the outcome of an election in Tanzania. You cannot. In Zimbabwe, you can, although I think the independence of the judiciary comes into question. But in Tanzania, you can't. I am saying this and then I stop here, Mike. I'm saying this because I'm saying when I'm disputing the fact that this is the worst election, I am not saying what happened on 23 August is excusable. No. I'm saying we need to understand what happened on 23 August in context. It is only when we do that, then we will be able to know how to move into the future and how to respond to what happened in 2023, August 23. Thanks, Mike.
Thanks, Justice. Let me stay with you, if you don't mind, just for the non-Zimbabwean audience. Can you say a little bit more about this question of CCC deciding not to go to court to contest the outcome? In South Africa, as you know very well, NGOs and political parties rush off to court at the drop of a hat the moment that they are dissatisfied with any particular outcome, and very often the courts, the judiciary, the constitution, the legal system comes to their aid and gives them the relief that they are looking for. That's not the case in Zim, but can you unpack that a little bit for us, this capturing of the judiciary? How thorough is it? Is there not a risk that there'll now be a perception, because the results are not being legally challenged, that they are in fact legally unassailable?
Let me answer that question within the context of a much broader question, which probably will be more useful to the audience, around the limitations on SADC's intervention. All right, because to what extent will we have SADC intervention resulting in a fresh election in Zimbabwe, as the CCC has, or Nelson Chamisa rather, has sort of demanded? Because not going to court is part of the sort of the demand for a fresh election in Zimbabwe. So the limitations are there, and they are quite strong. I think Prof has done a good job in talking about geopolitics. I don't need to repeat that. South Africa has an election in 2024. And I think they will be very hesitant to set a precedent. And I think I've also showed you some problematic elections in SADC. So I won't spend much time on that. Then the second issue is that I don't think there is appetite from ZANU-PF for that. I think I've often had views that ZANU-PF are desperate for legitimacy. They were desperate for legitimacy before 23 August. That's when they were desperate for legitimacy. They wanted someone to compete with them in this ritual, so that this ritual becomes an election, because all of you are calling it an election now. So that's what they wanted, and they got that, right? Now, the third point which limits SADC's intervention is this one: the contradictions of Nelson Chamisa's approach to this question. The first is what Colin has adequately covered, which is, at what point did you realize that you have concerns around judicial independence? Did you realize that after the election or before the election? Right. Is it a new discovery that there are concerns around judicial independence? So if you had these concerns before entering into an election, then perhaps your argument becomes stronger. But it becomes convoluted if you have first entered into the ritual, legitimized the ritual, and then you come out of it and then you say, no, we don't believe in the independence of the courts. The other issue is that you've been going to court prior to the election, even winning some of the battles. All right? So my point is, I'm not saying the judiciary is independent or not, because that's something that we need to debate, right? But I am saying the position that I will not go to court because the court is captured is coming rather late, when the horse has what? Bolted. The train has left the station. The legitimacy has been conferred by virtue of having participated in that election. Then lastly, that argument about courts being captured becomes a little bit hollow in a context where, as Prof. Brian mentioned, in a context where you have had a ritual that is called an election, and you believe you have been cheated, and I think you are right, you have been cheated, because it was designed for you to be cheated anyway. But then you embrace elements of the ritual. You know, if you go on Twitter today or on any social media, you will not only see those members of parliament from CCC getting sworn in, but the smiles, the gestures, they are quite concerning. They are so excited, right? Now, what kind of impression does that create to an ordinary observer, but also to these leaders in SADC? Then lastly, Mike, is the ideological issue. The ideological issue. I know that many people dismiss this aspect, but I'm happy that Prof touched on it earlier on. And he has also written on it anyway and can speak quite more competently than myself. But I think it's important to be ideologically very clear so that you are able to then establish ideological alliances within the region. I see that disconnect between our opposition and what they are trying to do. But let me say, before you all crucify me, I don't believe that there was an election. I never believed that. I am actually surprised that a very serious opposition actually went into this election and even promised people that they were going to win against all odds. I mean, these things are documented. You know, don't go into, no, we are going to win against all odds. What is your strategy? No, you don't need to know our strategy. We are pursuing strategic ambiguity, right? Those are things that then make everything clouded and everything convoluted. I do believe that if they had stayed out of this ritual, that argument about judicial capture would have probably made more sense and would have probably been more clear because you have stayed out of it. You have been consistent. Thanks, man.
Brian, how do you respond to the line that this was not an election, it was merely a ritual and the CCC should have stayed out?
Hello, yeah. I think Justice has made really good points about the opposition. The first thing you need to know, those smiles on MPs' faces, is because it's also about jobs. It's about employment. That this is livelihoods. In no way that if Chamisa had told people not to stand for elections, that they would not have stood, even as independents. And that would have caused problems within the CCC. So they were always going to stand, and once the election took place, they were always going to take their place in parliament. And that's the reality of opposition politics anywhere on the continent. You can't expect these guys just to pull out of that when they have no other livelihoods. And so the tension now is, how do you deal with the issues you've said about the ambiguities of the way they've dealt with the judiciary, being in parliament, in local government, and yet still questioning legitimacy and trying to see what SADC will do about it, and with the limits on SADC's capability to actually get themselves involved. I think one of the major challenges going ahead is what will happen to the opposition. What will happen in terms of their structures? How will they be able to build alliances for the future? And they need to think about the long-term future now. How do you rebuild and make yourself a much more effective opposition? Because this regime is not going anywhere. They're going to dig in their heels. Their very nature, their very future depends on controlling the state. The state is the center of accumulation for parties like this. Without the state, they have no basis for accumulation. Through the state, they're able to control resources, natural resources, who they make partnerships with in terms of raw materials, the control of public resources. And parties like this simply do not give up power through an election. And so strategically, you have to continue to push the democratic debate, but also to think long-term, how do you deal with this very central contradiction of power within post-colonial states?
I want to just turn then to another little aspect of this. We've been talking about the political opposition and what their role could or should be or should have been. What about civil society? Professor Brian mentioned in his presentation how long and hard civil society within Zimbabwe has been struggling to maintain some degree of democracy, to fight for democracy. What now? I'm going to come to you first, and then I'll ask Colin the same question. What's the role and what are the opportunities for civil society within the country, especially given some of the highly repressive legislation, the Patriot Act, the PVO Act, etc., that we've been hearing about?
Thank you. When it comes to civil societies, I think they're really playing their part. But the thing is, they are in bed with a very popular opposition party, but very weak in terms of strategies when it comes to dealing with ZANU-PF. So in as much as they are doing the groundwork, we've seen the human rights lawyers and all the campaigns that they're doing on social media. They then lack support from the CCC, because what CCC has done, it has in a way sort of built its own castle, and it doesn't work in hand with other people or other societies that members of the society that believe that see things differently. Let's look at the debate of around structures, CC having structures. The first thing that civil societies raised was the issue that CC is being formed and there are no structures. They didn't go to, they didn't have a conference to elect the president. Chamisa was just pushed, and they removed Cooper. And now, the moment civil societies raised that, they were called to be enemies, and they were accused of being ZANU-PF weapons. So now it becomes very difficult for civil society to actually do much more. In as much as they are pushing, they're being limited by CC itself.
Thank you. Colin, your take on this question?
Hello? Yes. I think the main challenge for civil society going forward is if the president assents to the PVO bill, Prof. Rafstropoulos talked about the patriotic bill as well, but the main challenge is the PVO bill. If it comes through, that's a big challenge for the activities and of civil society and them managing to influence policy or influence what the legislature does. But even within the same environment, because it's not like it was a free-for-all in civil society in Zimbabwe. It has always been tough. It has always been a difficult terrain, and civil society has managed a lot under the circumstances. What is required going forward is an intelligent civil society which manages to influence policy reform, policy changes, but more so because CCC controls more than 25 of the local authorities after this election. So there are civil society organizations working with local authorities, working for service delivery, working for, they might as well push to work with a local authority that listens, if they listen, a local authority which will not close them out, and a local authority which can then improve and probably improve the lives of people. CCC has a sizable number of MPs in parliament, and coming with all the smiles that Dr. Justice talked about, they must be ready to deliver some work, not necessarily change, but some work in terms of legislative reforms, some work in terms of reforms, electoral reforms that never happened before this election, and some work in terms of delivering a bit of better lives for the people of Zimbabwe, and civil society has this opportunity to contribute to.
Thank you. I just remind our Zoom audience, please to enter your questions and comments into the Q&A. We've had one, I'm going to refer it to Kudzai because it is about the diaspora question. The questioner wants to know, what effect would there have been on the elections had the diaspora population been able to vote? And if I can add something, has there ever been a Zimbabwean election in which Zimbabweans outside the country have had the opportunity to vote?
I don't think so, right, Justice? Zimbabweans have never voted. The Zimbabweans outside have never really voted. Definitely, it was gonna change. It was gonna change the dynamics of the election in as much as we know that either way, whatever could have happened, ZANU-PF was going to emerge as a winner, right? But it was going to make it very difficult for them to rig the election, because it was going to be a very tough and a difficult space for them to determine how the election will go.
Thank you. SADC, you've emphasized, a number of you, the fact that SADC's at least preliminary report on these elections is something of a break with the past, at least with the last few elections. Highly critical, very unpopular with ZANU-PF. The head of the SADC mission, Zambian Dr. Neves Mumba, was quite roundly criticized by ZANU-PF. What does this mean? Is this some sort of a breakthrough moment, that SADC is apparently taking a really independent view on this? And dare I ask whether you think, any of you, that the final report, as opposed to just the preliminary report, is going to stick to this level of criticism? Brian, would you like to start? What's the impact of this?
Look, I think certainly the preliminary report is different to many others, similar to the position taken in 2008 after the violence that happened then. Whether it will be a breakthrough, as I said in my presentation, that's a big question, because I think SADC is divided over these issues. Key members of the Troika are supporting the Mnangagwa regime, and that's an important part of SADC. And even if SADC goes ahead and emphasizes the points in the preliminary report, it can only make recommendations. It will rely on national institutions to take anything forward. So this will remain under the control of the Zimbabwean state. And just to respond to Justice, when I said it's the worst, I didn't mean in terms of violence. I mean in terms of the broader forms of authoritarian rule that have been brought into play. That the closing down of space through more subtle methods, more legislative forms, and a cloaking down on any spaces without using overt violence. Violence can come in different forms, not only the kind of direct violence, but the types of violence we've seen here legislatively, abuse of state resources, the infiltration of civil society, of opposition parties, and of course the increasing control of the media. But it's also taking place in a global perspective, which is giving more traction to regimes like the authoritarian regime in Zimbabwe because of the global crisis of liberal democracy, because former proponents of what was thought to be Western democracy are themselves in crisis, and because of the new battle for resources such as lithium, which are central to the technological changes taking place at global level. And so whatever SADC's response is going to be, my worry is that it's going to be subdued and it's going to be controlled by the state in Zimbabwe in terms of going forward.
Justice, do you have a different take on this?
Okay. So I don't think all hope is lost. Remember, first I emphasized that we need to understand the reality and accept the reality, and then you will then be able to come up with solutions that actually are much more effective. So I think there's a slide that Prof. Rapt showed, and I am glad it did show that slide, which indicates the sort of mandate that the observer mission, the SADC observer mission has, and I agree is quite correct. You will notice that what will happen in the event that this preliminary report finds its way to become the final report, and in the event that it is adopted, I think it might be more helpful to influence the next round of elections, right? But of course, depending on how civil society advocacy goes, but also depending also on how the opposition makes use of it. But let me take this opportunity to deal with also this other point about, the approach that is often used on these issues. I do believe that you build advocacy from below, not from the top. So in other words, whatever that SADC is going to do in Zimbabwe is dependent on what is being done internally. The amount and the level of pressure that is being exerted internally will then determine what SADC can do, right? My biggest concern, and this ties in very well with the role of civil society, my biggest concern is and maybe this is something that maybe the audience from outside of Zimbabwe may not be fully aware of. I do not think we have a strong opposition in Zimbabwe. I think we have a strong man. That's what we have. We have an individual who is very popular for many reasons, of course, but you can't deny the fact that he's popular. But I've often argued that I think Nelson's popularity is a great resource for change, but yet it might become his greatest undoing. What do I mean? What has happened and what is still happening is I see a sense of individualism in the opposition. Nelson was asked a very critical question before the elections, that what is your strategy for getting parliamentary majority? And he said, our focus is not on parliamentary election. Our focus is on the president. Now, how do you govern a country without parliamentary majority? But that's not the question. For me, it was an indicator of where the focus was. The focus was on getting Nelson into power. The focus was not on getting the team into power. This is why when Prof said the smiles are also telling when the MPs were inaugurated. Yeah, because they used their own resources to campaign. They didn't use party resources because there are no party resources to talk about. The party resources are deployed for presidential election, not for members of parliament. So they use their private resources, so they feel entitled to actually go to parliament. All right. Now, let me ask you a question. Where is Tendai Biti in all this? I have no license to speak on his behalf, by the way, but I'm just posing a question. Where is he on all this? Where is Wolfgang Ngube on all this? Right? Let me ask you a rhetoric question. Where is Job Sikala, the party's vice chairperson?
Maybe for the non-Zimbabweans, you should be explaining who these people are and why they're important.
Very important figures in the party that is called CCC, but also in the history of opposition movement in Zimbabwe. These are some of the best thought leaders that the Zimbabwean opposition has ever had. My view is the opposition in Zimbabwe, historically, has always benefited from thought leadership from certain constituencies, particularly in the academia, but also in the legal profession, right? But what I saw in the lead to the 2023 process is that there was demobilization. And I think Prof and I once spoke about this at some event. There was demobilization. These critical constituencies withdrew from CCC because their concerns were never addressed. Their concerns were, how are we going to be running this party when we don't have a constitution? And they were told that, no, we don't need a constitution because once we have a constitution, we'll be infiltrated. But does having a constitution really open you up to infiltration, or it strengthens internal governance? And, David Coltart is supposed to be the treasurer for the party, right? Has he played his role? Does he even know how the party finances work? Right? Of course, I want to emphasize, I have no license to speak on behalf of these people, but as an observer and who constantly writes about these issues, I am concerned that these are the signs of a weak opposition party. Now, with a weak opposition party that is led by an individualistic and yet very popular person, you are unlikely to get to be able to exert the kind of pressure you want to exert domestically in order to open the channels for a regional intervention.
Thank you. I want to cover some of the questions that are starting to come in the Q&A. So, yes. Right, so take them in order. Mike Deeb says, as I agree, there has never been a real election, i.e. a real free and fair election in Zimbabwe since 2002. What strategies remain for enabling change that will respond to the needs of the people? I'm going to just pose the second question and then open it to all of you to answer. So strategies, what strategies are there that can respond to the needs of the people? And then different question, how should international stakeholders react and act now? Governments, EU, non-state actors, including business and civil society. Colin, can I come to you first? What strategies are open for change?
For me, I think the most feasible strategy, which is good for the whole nation, is an engagement and dialogue strategy. But we're certain that we are not going to the courts. From what Justice was saying, we're certain that we are not going to have a ground-up revolution in the country. From what Prof was saying, we are not going to get a serious regional intervention that will reach to CCC's call for fresh elections. So for me, internal dialogue may be facilitated by the region, South Africa, for example, or SADC broadly. An internal dialogue, an internal engagement where the ZANU-PF and CCC sit down and agree on a way forward, agree on a couple of reforms pending the 2028 election, but agree to move forward, especially economically, and depolarize the country to ensure that even when we get to 2028, the country is better off in terms of poverty reduction. The country is better off in terms of polarization. I think in 2018, there were rumors, I must say, of an offer for leader of the opposition for Nelson Chamisa, which I think he snubbed if he was offered, but it would require a change of the constitution, I think. But that allows them to be able to control their 25 or more local authorities better without interference from local government. We are not a devolved federal country, so you will really not be able to work those local authorities without some sort of agreement, some sort of cohesion, some sort of working together, and what it signifies without any amount of dialogue, amount of understanding each other, is another 5 years of stagnation, another 5 years of polarization, another 5 years of illegitimacy, another 5 years of international isolation. And this spells doom for a whole generation in Zimbabwe, which is, I think, since 2000, not seen any light in the country. So any leader who is magnanimous, be it Mnangagwa, be it Chamisa himself, must be able to see Zimbabwe in that light, that we need to serve the people, we need to, as long as they are individualistic or serve their own parties, then we are doomed as a country.
I'm interested to know what the incentive is, in your view, for ZANU-PF to participate in a dialogue with which has as its aim some reforms, because they seem to have emerged, if you like, stronger now than they were before. What's the incentive for them?
The truth of the matter is that this election did not meet any semblance of a credible, free and fair election, and they know it. So it will be very difficult for them to manage the country, even internally, in terms of moving the country forward in cohesion. It's not about even what the West says. Maybe we might rely on our gold and smuggle it and what, and still develop. But the people themselves will not be developed. The people themselves will not be united. Jobs will not be created in mass. So poverty will retain. We're going to face El Nino this season. So our agriculture will be down. So you can already see the picture. And I don't think ZANU-PF is aloof to these impending challenges.
Okay, Justice.
Can I quickly build on what Colin mentioned? Of course, I think it's Brian, you said it's Brian, the other Brian, Kagoro, who wrote the paper, Prisoners of Hope. We are prisoners of hope. So if you may allow me to be for a moment. Another opportunity I think that is there is the fact that I think Zimbabwe as a country has entered into a phase which it has never entered before, constitutionally speaking, you know, where you have the incumbent serving his last term, right? Then number two, there is a constitutional provision which prohibits the amendment of the constitution to extend tenure. So that is an opportunity, right? To then have an incumbent who probably appreciates that he cannot run again. And I also think that the internal dynamics within ZANU may not easily allow him to actually run again. But I'm not ruling out that possibility. So don't quote me and say, just to say, this will never happen. In politics, you never say never, right? But it's an opportunity that we have such a constitutional framework, which then maybe may give some comfort for the kind of dialogue that Colin is talking about. But then again, you're going to need a strong opposition, not a strong man or a strong woman. You're going to need a strong opposition, and then you're going to need a strong civil society. Mike, I think, if I may take this opportunity to say what can be done, I think if there is help that SADC and the international community can give to Zimbabwe, I think it's to try and leverage on whatever advantage they have to move this government away from closing civic space. Because a lot is going to depend on the ability of civil society to hold government accountable for the next 5 years to mitigate against corruption, to mitigate against human rights violations. I think that is where the focus needs to be. And to encourage internal dialogue that is not necessarily focused on, you know, forming a government of national unity, because I don't think that appetite is there. You were right to say it's there. I don't think that appetite is there from ZANU. Just look at the speed with which they have moved to establish their new government. That is already sending signals that we are not interested in a government of national unity. It's not coming. And the idea that they are isolated from SADC, it's false. Just because there were 3 presidents who attended Mnangagwa's inauguration. But we should look into history and look at how many presidents have actually been attending inaugurations for other presidents. President Masisi was only 3 also in Botswana, right? But Colin is right that this election was a big embarrassment, right? That they would like to, you know, try and get the country to move together with them. Mnangagwa is serving his last term. He might also thinking about legacy and so forth. Those are the leverages to sort of maybe press on in order to mitigate against closure of civic space, so that you can then have citizens and the civil society able to organize, mobilize each other. If they decide to hold government, then they can do so accountable. If they decide to come up with an alternative, a political alternative, they can do so. But they can't do all these things if civic space is closed. So that's where the focus must be on.
Responding to one of the questions and leading on from that, is there a role for institutions further afield? We've spoken about SADC, but what about, for example, the EU, the Commonwealth, such bodies. As you mentioned that the UN Secretary General made a statement about the elections and so on. Does the wider international community have any sway with ZANU-PF, particularly when it comes to, say, keeping the civic spaces open?
I think a lot of how the international community engages often depends on the regional intervention and the continental intervention. They will not be able to move on their own without it being seen as a regime change agenda. And that feeds into a narrative that ZANU-PF loves. That's central to its legitimization. So any movement would have to come through SADC. The issue, I don't think Zimbabwe is going to be allowed back into the Commonwealth at this stage. I doubt that will happen. Any attempts to move at the UN would be blocked by China and Russia because of their close alliance with the regime, so that won't go very far. I think that what the two speakers have already said, the idea of a national dialogue is important, and that it's important for civil society to maintain its commitment to peaceful democratic transition, to not get drawn into anything else. And to do that, they need, both the opposition and civil society need to rethink their position. They need a critical analysis of what has happened over the last 4 decades. Where are we now? What are the options? And particularly the opposition has not had this critical debate within itself since the time of Tsvangirai. They need a critical discussion on the state of the opposition. And that will be, for me, one of the main things they need to do now is to take time to reflect, to engage with others around where to move forward. The national dialogue will only come if there's a country in the region which will help to push it. We have an idea, we've been told that ANC are involved in delicate conversations with ZANU-PF. I'm not sure what that is.
Since about 1998, I think.
This delicate conversation is about a national dialogue, then fine. Let's see where they can go with this. Ramaphosa's strength is always in negotiations. Let's see if he's able to push and say, okay, look, you've seen the report, you've seen the international responses. If you want to move forward, you need to put something on the table. You need to come with something to say, okay, even if I'm not going to accept a rerun, I want to also find a way forward, because Zadera will stay in place. There's no way the US are going to move on that position. Most of the EU sanctions are already gone. It's only on particular military operations that are going on. And the African Development Bank negotiations will come back onto the agenda in terms of arrears. And it's likely that that might be a point of emphasis in a discussion going forward. And for the international community, I suspect that's where they will put their pressure. But it would be a moment for South Africa to step forward again, if they are in negotiations, to say, how do we get a national dialogue going? Because the GNU is off the table, as the speakers have said. ZANU-PF have no inclination to move in that direction, but they may move forward on a controlled national dialogue. And it will be a dialogue where their legitimacy must be accepted as a government. That would be a prelude for that. They won't go into it unless that's on the table as well. And so it's a very good, delicate situation again at the moment. Yeah.
So you raised the possibility that South Africa and President Ramaphosa may have some sort of a role to play in facilitating dialogue, etc. I want to ask, and I'll ask you, Kudzai, when you saw President Ramaphosa trooping off to attend the inauguration, and you find that he was one of only 3 out of the 16 SADC heads of state to attend, the other 2 being Mozambique and the DRC, how did that make you feel? I'll tell you how it made me feel later, but how did you feel as a Zimbabwean living in South Africa?
Thank you. It is quite interesting and very much expected, given that Fikile Mbalula had tweeted a lot regarding ZANU-PF. So I wasn't shocked at all, but then it became concerning for me, because right now we've got an immigration crisis in South Africa, and the primary cause of it, it's Zimbabwe, it's the Zimbabwean government. So for me, because it's been a concern and a lot has been happening and a lot of conversation has been happening around that particular issue, from the crime rates and all that. So now for him to go there and actually support Mnangagwa, yet he's got a crisis that is as a result of Mnangagwa's government, was a bit shocking. And also knowing, obviously, and it was indicating where South Africa is when it comes to ZANU-PF. They are in support of ZANU-PF as it stands. And no matter what will happen, we have seen it happen with Mbeki as well. Mbeki went there to negotiate, and what we saw what came out of those negotiations was the endorsement of Gabe as well. And it seems like it's continuing. The legacy is continuing. There is no change in that direction.
Very difficult to understand what the possible benefit is to South Africa of adopting that kind of a position. Question that comes up here, and it touches on something that you have already mentioned, also particularly you, Justice. Question from David Moore asking, can anyone give us an indication of the nature of the new bunch of MPs in both parties? Are there an indication of a new and perhaps different generation? So you've spoken about the strong man in the opposition, but the weakness of the opposition as a whole. When you look at the current crop of MPs in both ruling party and opposition, do you see any signs of hope there?
Hi, David. That's a good question. I very much enjoy what David writes, particularly on Zimbabwean politics. I think, to be fair, there is a mixture of legislators that have emerged out of this process. The good thing is that there are quite a lot of legislators that are young and energetic, particularly from Triple C. So we are expecting that the debates will be more vibrant and more strategic. There's also good representation of, gender balance. I don't have the statistics as yet, but I think we've got a good mixture. The concern is the institutional independence of parliament, right? Because the way things work in Zimbabwe is almost like the way things work here in South Africa. But to what extent is parliament able to hold the executive accountable and so forth? So that's a challenge. But certainly we have a good mixture of members of parliament. And I even think at a local government level, there is also a good caliber of councillors. We have people like David Coltart in Bulawayo. We have people like a lot of young men and women in Harare. The question again is, to what extent will the municipalities be independent? What I like, rather what I have a little bit of more hope about, is that the caliber of people that are likely to lead these councils are people that are probably have a bit of integrity. So my hope is that we are going to see less and less corruption, because truth be told, I think there has been a lot of corruption in the previous term, even in the opposition-controlled municipalities. And there's also been maladministration, failure to basically deliver basic services, which has also, I think, demoralized some of the voters. So that is likely to change. But of course, on condition that the municipalities are able to be given space to do their work. And I come back to his point, that is where the dialogue needs to be. I think what the opposition needs to do is to use whatever that they got out of this ritual that they participated in as to open space for the next step, right? And I think the negotiations should be around trying to mitigate central government's interference with those municipalities, so that those municipalities are able to deliver service and show and boost the morale and the confidence of the Zimbabweans in the governance of the opposition. Because that has also been an issue. While the rigging of elections is an issue, but the failure by the opposition to also deliver on some of their promises, especially at that level of local government, has been an issue, right? So that's my hope that you will have that space. Yeah.
Thank you. There's a question here directed at you, Brian. You did not mention the composition of the ZEC, the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission, as an organization. Should this not be scrutinized when reports are that there are many sons and daughters of prominent ZANU-PF members there? Is there not a conflict of interest within the ZEC? Your response to that?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think it's mentioned in the reports, and it's very clear that the ZEC is hugely compromised, has been for a long time, and any movement forward in terms of reforms would have to look at the nature of the ZEC, its composition, its terms of reference, its accountability to Parliament, and in terms of open discussions. It's been central to the lack of credibility of this election. And so any movement forward must have reform of ZEC at its center. You know, the Mnangagwa government has made it its choice of strategy to ensure that ZEC is under its control. That has been central to the kind of authoritarian logic that we've seen in the politics of this government. And so any movement forward will need to look very closely at ZEC.
I'm going to come to the audience in the room in a minute and ask if you have any questions or comments, but just one more before we get there. The figures that Brian showed of the voting in the different provinces show very, very clearly, and to no one's surprise, that the opposition wins hands down in the two major metropolitan areas, Harare, Bulawayo. And more or less, the further you go into the rural districts, the stronger ZANU-PF is. We experience something vaguely similar in this country as well. There's some of our political scientists who are arguing that the biggest single divide in our country is going to be, if it isn't already, the urban-rural divide. And when we look to next year's South African elections, we're seeing so many predictions that the ANC will lose its majority in the urbanized provinces like Gauteng, possibly KZN. Of course, they lost their position in the Western Cape here a very long time ago. Putting aside the rigging questions, just looking at it purely.
Opposition party be capable of being in power in situations where they don't achieve change. And then the last thing is just Africa seems to be in a coup season with all the conflicts going on. It appears African countries and bodies are not even able to, well, they don't seem to be you know, playing an active role or achieving anything in that political scenarios. On what basis would a global or international players have any justification in joining the fray in circumstances where African countries, AU, doesn't even, you know, it's not even possible for them to have an influence? Thank you.
Brian, you go first.
Webster. Yeah, since the coup, the army, not only since the coup, the army is central to ZANU-PF as a party. And since the coup has been more overtly in control. And so whatever happens in ZANU-PF now has the military at its center. And that's part of the discussions we know are going on about the leadership battles that are likely to take place within ZANU-PF. The fact that Kasugere was kept out is because of the factional battles within ZANU-PF. The fear that he could have split the vote within ZANU-PF and lessen the vote for Mnangagwa. And that was the biggest fear around Kasugere. And that therefore I think the military probably played a key role in saying that you can't let this man in here, or because it will cause us many problems. Similarly, there were discussions earlier this year about having a national agreement on polling agents having a joint training across party lines. That agreement was made in June of this year. I mean, in March of this year, and then in June it was reneged because I'm told because the military warned that such a thing could lead to problems for Mnangagwa's election. How true that is, I don't know, but that indicates the fear of an open election, which comes down to the opposition. Question you asked what the opposition. First of all, the opposition have won elections, but they've been denied the right to take power. But if by chance they did come in, there would be major hurdles. Legacies of institutional legacies, the military, for example, would not be under their control. The judiciary, they would have to fight to change the judiciary. Local government structures, which is the heart of control of rural areas, would have to be challenged. So winning power would only be the first step of changes, and the chances of regression would be huge, and the chances of frustration would be huge. But it would indicate a step forward, however problematic. What we're seeing in West Africa, the coups, these are a combination of the frustration of outside imperial influence, France in particular, and the construction of France within West African countries and its legacies, but also the frustrations around the slowness of the process on democratic reform. That if democratic governments are not moving fast enough, people begin to lose hope. And it's not only in African countries. We saw what happened in the US, where you had a massive questioning of democratic accountability led by an incredibly, I don't know what to call Trump. There's so many words to be used for him. But he's able to draw on a great deal of resentment, on a great deal of marginalization, on a racialization of politics, which is not new in the US. It's a long legacy that what Trump is drawing on. And so the key here is that the battle for democracy is not won through one election. It's won through decades, probably centuries of struggle. And we are in that phase where we're going to have to go through those setbacks. It doesn't mean you don't keep fighting for it. Because if we don't, we're going to have this legacy of legitimizing authoritarian rule because democratic alternatives are seen as not having no traction. And that is a huge step that we have to avoid.
Someone going to answer Ched's question?
Brian has technical.
Okay.
But go ahead.
Colin?
Yeah, I really didn't want to answer that one, but anyway, to just say that in my view, I think, yes, he would have split a bit of votes, maybe to cause a runoff, but not necessarily a big chunk from ZANU-PF, but maybe to cause a runoff. But I think I was a bit taken aback by the fact that he has a history of intelligence, and he failed to have his passport stamped in the last 18 months. Yet ordinary Zimbabweans who are staying here and don't need to go back just get their passport stamped. So it becomes a bit of a challenge. I think the sophistry just ended with being passenger number 34, but for me, that's about it. I just wanted to add a bit more to the issue of the opposition winning a 2/3 majority, the chances of that happening and that sustaining. I think the reverse question would be, how many of the third wave of democratization governments are still in power? Almost none. I think that summarizes what that means. And then just to add from, I think those who have read or come across what Frantz Fanon said, our our government or leadership tends to realize when they get into leadership that the others were not as wrong as he thought they were in managing people and governing. I think governance in general is a complex system, and for Africans in particular, we are inheriting a system that is not inherent to us, that is not local to us. So to naturalize it becomes very difficult. So at the end of the day, a few months into government, you realize that there is a modus operandi to how things are done. I think I would ask another question: what has Hichilema done so differently besides the geopolitical influences and particularly what has just happened in Zimbabwe? What has he done so differently to warrant or to say that the opposition is here in fact? Yeah.
And I quickly weigh
Yeah,
in on
sure,
to,
sure.
I'm glad that Webster asked this question about the military, but and I agree with the response that Prof gave. Let me just also build on that, but from a legal practitioner point of view. So there is, and it ties also with the question about what should be the focus of the dialogue and the discussion in Zimbabwe. There's a very dangerous legal precedent that many people are not talking about in Zimbabwe, and which I think the leaders in SADC might have appetite to actually exert their influence on. So you know that in 2017 there was a military operation which effectively was a coup. Some people say it's a coup that went private. It's said that the opposition embraced the coup, kissed the soldiers in the streets. There are those images, and but here is the sad thing. There is a case that was decided by the High Court. The title is Vanda versus President of Zimbabwe, I think something like that. And interestingly, one of Chamisa's advisors played a very crucial role in that case. The case basically, the court basically ruled that what happened in 2017, the military operation, the activities of the military in 2017 were lawful. Are we together? That's what the court said, were lawful. Then later on, there was another case, I think it's called Liberal Democrats versus President of Zimbabwe, which was then heard in the Constitutional Court. The Constitutional Court refused to entertain the question whether what the army had done in 2017 was lawful or not. It said, no, there is already a position by the High Court, so we are not going to open that debate. I was said, of course, that the Constitutional Court refused to review that position, but to some extent I was relieved that they actually didn't give a solidified position. So they left the question open. Right. But as we speak, or as I speak right now, it is lawful in Zimbabwe for the military to intervene, as long as they can justify that we want to protect the Constitution. It's lawful. It's there. I'm talking about judgments that are there. You can go and read the paper that I did titled Constitutional Courts as Sites of Human Rights Struggles. Right? I explained those two cases extensively. Right? And that is the legal position in Zimbabwe, that the military can intervene and remove the government, as long as the military can justify that they are doing so in order to protect the Constitution. Right. And I think it's a dangerous precedent that needs to be addressed, especially in the context of what's happening across the continent. ZANU-PF dynamics, it's a party that is in transition. Yes, but I also think that some of these things around Passenger 34 and so forth, I think they are overly sensitized, sensationalized, sorry. Here is the thing. You watched the inauguration of Emerson. And you saw the way he was embraced by three key figures who belonged to the Generation 40 faction. For those that are not familiar, the coup was effectively a result of a fight between two factions in ZANU-PF, one aligned to the current president and the other aligned to Grace Mugabe, the former First Lady. But when you then look at what happened at the inauguration, you see that the First Lady was there embracing them. I don't believe those are just optics, right? The former vice president, who was also in Grace Mugabe's faction, attended the inauguration, embraced the president. For me, that is a sign that the party is moving towards embracing Emerson. Of course, for selfish reasons, because they have to protect their ill-gotten wealth. There is no one in these two factions who is innocent, by the way. There is no one. They have stolen, they have tortured Zimbabweans. So in order for them to keep their wealth, they finally realized that no, they can't remove this man because they tried. So they are now coalescing. What you are likely to see, and I'm afraid, you are likely to see factionalism in ZANU-PF, but you are likely to see also a party that behaves differently from what you have seen in the past. Right. So for those that then hope to see an implosion of ZANU-PF, I would like to say maybe you might be disappointed because I don't think that is going to come and I don't think that is going to happen. Why? Because of other point I mentioned earlier, that you have a president who is serving his last term, right? Constitutionally speaking, and he may try to do some gymnastics here and there, but I don't think he will succeed. But that might actually bring some kind of stability in the party, which I think will then spell doom for some of the expectations that we have had in terms of ZANU implosion and so forth and so forth. Yeah.
Good, any response from your side?
Well, just to comment on that aspect. You know, there's a clip that goes around on social media when Mnangagwa is at the party. He simply says, "We are the army, we are the court, we are everything," basically. So if you want to know the position of the army, I think that statement actually summarizes the position of the army in Zimbabwe. Yeah.
Any last comments or questions from the floor? We have just a couple of minutes left. Yeah, we have one at the back. Go ahead.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to ask a question in regards to what Justice just said now, where he said he doesn't see any implosion in ZANU-PF. And I just wanted to ask, given the fact that we now have the G40 people now being embraced by Emerson, we saw them attending the inauguration and all that. And you are saying it's Emerson's last term. Can we not see a renewal of the G40 Lacoste fight again, as they will try to probably influence Emerson's successor? Can that not then lead to an implosion? Because obviously, as them embracing Emerson, they might also have an end goal to say, okay, since he's going, we need to go back into the feeding trough. So can that not lead to an implosion, or we are just saying they are already we are already rendering them powerless?
Justice.
Okay, I can just respond quickly. I think a bit of context will also help all of us here. That we must understand that the history between, the ties between ZANU-PF and the military are historical. Right, the way that Zimbabwe attained its independence, different from the way other countries in this region attained their independence, in the sense that the collaboration between the party of the revolution and the armies of the revolution was so integrated to a point where I think, practically speaking, it's difficult, and it has always been difficult to separate ZANU from the military because of that history. Constitutionally speaking, yes, there is supposed to be that distinction, but in real terms, that distinction has never been there. Now, Now, that then means whoever is able to control ZANU, rather, let me say, whoever is able to control the military will be able to control ZANU. Right? If you don't have control of the military, you're out of power. I think G40 was vanquished, right? I think they are now history. Even if you look at the whole group of G40, it has also disintegrated. You are aware that some have written letters of apology. Some are tweeting every day, showing their allegiance to the leader, right? Then you just have Xavier and a few others who are still fighting, right? So I don't think there is any opportunity for them. I think there is an opportunity for other factions to arise that we can't rule out, and they are agreeing. We can't rule out. In politics, you never say never. There is that possibility, but I was just saying, probably because they stand to gain more as a party if they are sort of united right now, but also because the party's control, the party actually doesn't exist. The party is just a civilian face, in my view, of what happens in the ground. So unless you are suggesting that there is likely to be a split within the security forces, which I don't see happening. I don't think it's going to happen. Is there discontentment and disillusion? Yes, there is. Like in every other movement, there are people who are discontented. There are people who have been, but I don't think there are realistic chances that you will see an implosion in ZANU. I wouldn't, if I were to do scenario planning, I wouldn't put that as a big factor. Right, I wouldn't.
Okay, thank you very much. There's one last little contribution from the Zoom audience. If you thought it couldn't get worse, David Moore says, Grace Mugabe for the next president, wait until 2028. So I'm just going to say thank you on behalf of everybody. To our four panelists, Colin, Justice, Brian, and Kudzai, thank you very much indeed for your contributions. For a non-Zimbabwean, very, very enlightening. It's way more complex than I thought it was, but I've certainly learned a lot. To everybody out there on the Zoom audience, thank you for sticking with us. Apologies for the breakdown. You know what load shedding does, just sort of blew the connections, but many of you have come back both times, and we appreciate that. And for those of you who joined us here in the audience, thank you. You get to share the finger lunch with us in a couple of minutes. Our co-hosting organizations, DGRU at University of Cape Town Law Faculty, Hanns Seidel Foundation, who have put up the money for this, my colleagues in the Catholic Parliamentary Liaison Office, who in particular, that's been very helpful in keeping the whole thing going, to our tech people, Justin and Nick, thank you very much indeed. We'll revisit this question, I'm sure, down the line. We try to take an intelligent interest in what happens in the region, even though our office is very much concerned with our own South African political developments. Everything has an impact on everything else. The ramifications stretch easily across our borders. That's sometimes a good thing and sometimes not so much. But thank you very much, and we'll see you next time.